As Lieutenant Nolte mentioned, I'm going to be discussing the shooting that happened in the 6600 block of East Central. However, before I make my comments, I'd like to introduce the Eastboro Chief of Police, Danny Bartlesbang, who is here with me today. One of his officers was involved in that situation, and so I asked him to attend the briefing in case you may have questions of Chief Bartlesbang in regard to his officers and the relationship that we have with them. So that's why he's here. You know, when you look at the situation that happened last night, it was very disturbing, the fact that it evolved so quickly on a call just to check a suspicious character, where it wind up officers having to use their weapon to deal with a very non-compliant and agitated person that they came in contact with. What I'm going to try to do is walk you through a timeline and try to hit the highlights of what we know thus far in the investigation. About 7:55 last night, we had a motorist called 911 to report that there was a white male jumping out in the middle of traffic for northbound Woodlawn. About 5 minutes later, we got a second call from another complainant that called. They were getting a report, white male jumping out in front of the traffic. They gave a description. One of the WPD officer, was dispatched to that location at about 8:02. She was in close proximity of Central and Woodlawn, and so she was able to get there within a timely manner. As the officer arrived in the 6600 block of East Central, she noticed the suspect, or she notices a white male that matched the description that was given out by 911, which was a white male wearing a gray shirt, black shorts, barefoot. And sure enough, she located him. They're just to the east of, there's a business about 6611 East Central, and so she pulls into the driveway of that business. About that time, the Eastboro police officer arrives as a backup. And so as the officer is getting out of her vehicle, she walks around the rear of her vehicle to make sure that she continued to maintain visual on the suspect who was standing there in front of the business. As she approached the suspect, she's basically trying to talk to him to figure out what's going on. You know, why is he jumping out in the middle of traffic, to see if there was some type of medical concerns that he may have. And as the officer approached the gentleman, he was non-compliant. He didn't respond. He backed away briefly, and then he reapproached the officer. During this time, he has his hands in his pockets, and so she doesn't know if he has a weapon or not. She doesn't have her weapon because, there again, this is a suspicious character. She's trying to determine exactly what's going on, if he needs some type of assistance. And so she's giving him command, take your hands out of your pocket, which he does not do. And like I said, as she approaches him, he backs up, and then he reapproaches her. And as he's approaching her, she's constantly giving him commands to show your hands. He's mumbling, he's nodding his head, he's agitated, he's non-compliant, and within seconds, he pulls his hands out of his pocket, and he has an unknown object. The object, when you look at it, and hopefully we'll be able to provide you with a copy of what that object looks like. When you look at it, it looks like a large type of nozzle that had an open end which resembles a barrel of a gun, and it has a trigger. And so as she sees that, he puts it right in her face, and as he puts it in her face briefly, he turns and runs towards the Eastboro officer. She's assuming that she's been shot because, there again, it happened so quickly in front of her, and she's backing up, pulling her weapon. As he's running towards the Eastboro officer gets out of the way. The officer fires several shots. Subsequently, he was struck in the left thigh area as he was trying to run away from the officer. The officer fired multiple shots at the suspect at the time of the incident. According to the officers that we interviewed, each one of them feared for their lives because, there again, they didn't know what this guy had. Because when you look at the large object and you look at the front end of it, it resembles a barrel. And so in your mind, you're processing gun. And that's what the officer was doing, and that's why the officer pulled her weapon and fired several rounds. The officer, she described the object. She thought it was a small handgun. A small caliber gun is what she said at the time. The Eastboro officer doing his interview could hear our officer giving commands to the suspect to show his hands. There again, he didn't comply. And so when he moved it to another level where he pulled this object out, that's where things changed within a split second. The suspect was transported to Westwood Medical Center where he was treated, and ironically he was released. The key there is when you talk with the officers, they're very clear during their interviews that they feared for their lives. The officer feared not only for her life, but also the life of the Eastboro officer. And she even thought that she had been shot because after the incident, she checked herself to make sure that there was no injuries. I mean, that's how it evolved so quickly. When you look at the suspect himself, he's an escaped absconder from the Kansas Department of Correction. I want to say May 31st, he escaped from Winfield. KDOC had a warrant out for his arrest. He's 40 years old. During the interview, he acknowledged that he has been consuming ice as well as Valiums and also Xanax. So he's been taking those combination of drugs over the last several days, which may be the reason why he was acting agitated in the manner that he was. Of course, the officers will be placed on administrative leave. We're going to work with the Eastboro Police Department to make sure that we allow their officer to go through the evaluation process that we send our officers through anytime they're involved in a shooting or an incident of this nature. Because like I said, the officer was there to assist us, and we appreciate it. Even after the suspect went down, we still had to wrestle the object out of his hand. He still had the object in his hand as he went down to the ground in front of the Eastboro police car. The suspect was booked for 2 counts of aggravated assault, as well as the Kansas Department of Corrections escape warrant that was out for his arrest. When you look at our officer, she's been on about 6.5 years with the Wichita Police Department, and I do believe that the Eastboro officer has been with Eastboro a little over 4 years, I do believe. Chief Bartlesbane can clarify that if you have questions from that standpoint. You know, this, as I mentioned to you before, it was very disturbing to see a call of that nature to evolve into a deadly situation because there again, the gentleman did not comply. He was agitated, he was mumbling, and you know, we just don't understand why he just didn't do what was asked. But he chose to put the officers in danger, and the officers, they use the necessary force to deal with that situation. Their training kicked in about that time. So, questions of me or Chief Bartlesbane?
Chief, just a couple of clarifications. This nozzle, was this like a hose nozzle that he had on him, or I'm just a little bit confused as far as
It's like a garden hose type thing?
It looks like a nozzle that would go on sort of a air hole or air container for big types of jobs and stuff. Pardon me?
Like used on a pressure sprayer or something like that?
Yes. And so when you look at this nozzle and you look at it, you look at the gold part, it looks like a barrel. And then you look at the trigger, that's what the officer was looking at. And so there again, things happen so quickly, and the officer assessed and made that decision to use the necessary force to deal with that situation.
And he pulled that out of his pocket and pointed it like a gun.
He
right?
pulled it out of his pocket. Both officers, the Eastboro police officer as well as the officer, says he comes up with both hands around it, and even as he's running towards the Eastboro officer, he still has that object pointed at the Eastboro officer.
When you say running toward the Eastboro officer, this is when he was running away from the WPD officer
Correct.
and retreating?
Yeah, he was moving away from the WPD officer, running towards the Eastboro officer, and that's when our officer pulled her weapon because she thought he was going to. She thought she was shot, and she thought he was going to shoot the Eastboro officer, and that's when she fired.
Did she hear a gunshot prior to that action? Did she think she heard one?
She thought she heard, like I said, she thought she was shot because it happened so fast. And like I said, when you look at this here and you see that barrel, and you come out, you pull in your weapon, and then you see him run towards your fellow officer, you take those steps that you need to take to deal with that situation.
How far apart were the two officers when this happened? Would you estimate?
It's hard to give an estimation because it happened so quick.
Did a projectile actually come out of that thing?
No, actually, like I said, it's a nozzle. But there again, when you're a police officer, you're not going to take time to assess what is this. I mean, we can look at it several hours after the fact and see that it was a nozzle that's attached to another piece of equipment. But at that time, the officer is evaluating, assessing, and making determination on how to deal with that situation.
Did the Eastboro officer also involved in this shooting as well? Did he fire or she fire a shot?
No, actually, the only one that fired a shot was the Wichita Police Department officer.
Did the Eastboro officer pull out their duty weapon?
Yes, the Eastboro officer did pull out his weapon.
You said multiple. Do you guys have an exact figure, or is that part of the investigation?
That is part of the investigation. We fired multiple. Well, the officer fired multiple rounds.
You also said earlier that he was on ice, Xanax, and Valium. Just to clarify, ice is a form of meth.
Meth. It's a form of meth. They call it meth. They call it ice. They got different names for it.
Which leg was he hitting?
Left thigh.
Left eye?
This brings up the question of whether this could have been what they call officer-assisted suicide. Do you believe he had been trying to do that? Or, I mean, obviously he wasn't killed, but do you think during the questioning that you had with the suspect, did that topic come up?
There was no indication on his behalf that there was anything connected to an officer-involved suicide, no.
Was there any notification on the escape from Winfield to the officers? Were they aware, or were they briefed that this person might be out there, or any indication?
Well, they issued a warrant, I'm going to say, back on May the 31st, so it was sent out to all law enforcement agencies throughout the state of Kansas to be on the lookout for the suspect because he's in the system. And so as soon as he escaped back in May, they went ahead and issued a warrant because he was in at Scoundrel. Okay.
The officer that was fired upon, I want to say last Thursday, this female officer has been on duty for 6.5 years. This officer, this female officer, has been on duty for 6.5 years. Any chance it's the same officer?
No, it's not the same officer. They were in the same class. Chief Bartleby, any comments with regards to your officer? Please feel free.
Oh, I just would like to note that Wichita routinely backs our officers there in Eastboro. As you know, Eastboro is surrounded by Wichita, and that in turn we routinely back their officers, and I was glad that my officer was there and available to assist on this call. And I'm glad that neither officer sustained any injuries. I feel that both officers acted appropriately, and this had a good resolution for both of them.
Danny, how long has it been since an Eastboro officer's been involved in the shooting?
I can't think of any myself personally, not since I've been chief anyway, and I can't think of any prior to that. There's some other people around here who have been around as long as I have been, so they may recall some, but I don't.
Kind of a reminder that what might seem like a routine call can suddenly take a dark turn in no time. Huh?
Yeah, that's something that all officers face. Just like the chief said, something that seems routine in microseconds can turn to something deadly or dangerous. And like I said, fortunately, this had a good resolution for our officers.
Danny, can you talk about how your officer managed to get out of the line of fire or assisted the WPD officer and taking down the suspect by moving so quickly? Or
Well, again, like Chief said, their training kicked in, and of course, a threat. In the movies, they see you show the officers just standing their ground, but they're trained to move, get out of the threat zone, and then re-engage. And that's what he did, and assisted in taking the suspect into custody after he went down.
Because he was shot near the Eastboro police officer's patrol car, correct?
Yes.
In front of it, to the side, can you give a...
Both, off to an angle off to the right side.
Was this in the parking lot or up the street? I'm sorry.
The car was in the street.
I just wanted to, Chief Williams, clarify, you said escapee. Is that, would you classify it as an escapee or an absconder, or is escapee
Apparently
direct turn?
he was assigned to Winfield facility and escaped from the facility back in May. So they
The
use the
actual
word.
prison, correctional facility.
What was he in there for?
I want to say for burglary, I do believe a burglary case that happened back in 2010. He was sentenced in 2011, so he was in for the burglary.
Good morning. We're going to briefly cover the officer-involved shooting incident in the 1800 block of Denise Marie, more or less happening contemporaneously with the event that the chief just described out on Central. The suspect that we shot in this case is named Robert McCosh, and the last name is MCCOSH. He's a 21-year-old white male. The incident happened in the 1800 block of Denise Marie, that is in the far west side of the city, in the 119th and 17th Street North areas. As with any officer-involved shooting, I'll go over the facts of the case. We are 12 to 14 hours into an investigation. I had investigators work all night, and we'll work all day today on this. I'll be limited in what I can answer as far as questions. I'll do the best I can, but there's some things we just don't know at this time because the investigation is so new. And I'll do this a little bit differently. I'm going to go through a time sequence first. I'm going to go backwards and kind of tell you what was going on during that time sequence. The call came out at 8:10 p.m. It came out as a disturbance with a weapon. Dispatch assigned 2 police officers and a supervisor, which is standard protocol for the police department. At 8:16 p.m., the call was elevated to a burglary in progress, again at the 1800 block of Denise Marie. The call came from, I should say the original 911 call came from a local healthcare provider. The call at 8:16 p.m., which elevated the call to a burglary in progress, came from an actual house on Denise Marie Street. At 8:21 p.m., dispatch felt the seriousness of the case had elevated to a point they assigned a 3rd police officer. So now we have 3 officers and a supervisor en route. And all officers arrive at the location and converge at 8:29 p.m. The suspect is shot at 8:37 p.m. Now I'll go back and kind of tell you the story from a police angle of what happened on this case. Mr. McCosh has a history of mental illness. He arrives at his mother's house, who lives in the 1800 block of Denise Marie, a little bit after 5 p.m. In addition to mental illness, Mr. McCosh uses drugs, and this compounded the situation. And at some point in the evening, he becomes involved in a disturbance with his mother. This disturbance escalates. His mother calls a local mental health provider who's giving care to Mr. McCosh, and they try to de-escalate him through this method. It does not work. Mr. McCosh becomes more violent to the point where the health care provider recommended to the mother to escape the house and leave, which she does. At that point, the health care provider called 911, and that is our initial call at 8:10 p.m. Mr. McCosh's mother runs to the next door neighbor's house. She goes in, and the neighbor is nice enough to let her in. Mr. McCosh is following, and he has armed himself with 2 large 14 to 18-inch blade machete-style knives. At this point, the neighbor also calls 911, as Mr. McCosh is trying to break into that house. There's glass breaking, they hear damage to the house, and the two women retreat to a bedroom and lock themselves in it and are simultaneously calling 911, and that is when the call is elevated to the burglary in progress at 8:16 p.m. Officers arrive and walk up to the residence. There's 4 officers, 3 police officers and a supervisor. One of the officers is confronted by Mr. McCosh on the west side of the house, outside of the house. He's still armed with 2 14 to 18-inch machete-style blades. The officer begins to give multiple commands, and the other officers can hear this confrontation, so they also converge on that side of the house. All officers and the actual officer that ends up shooting all know Mr. McCosh. We have made 14 calls and police cases at that house since 2010. And they are confident that they can de-escalate him. The officers are. At one point, while all the officers are trying to de-escalate the situation and talk him into dropping the knives, he throws one of the machetes at the officer's direction. The officers avoid it and continue to try to dialogue with him. This goes on for a couple of minutes. At one point, Mr. McCosh begins to close the gap. He's threatening with the remaining machete in his hand, and one officer fires a single round, striking Mr. McCosh in the torso. He is transported to Via Christi. Today he is in serious but stable condition. When the suspect is released from the hospital, he will be facing numerous felony counts, aggravated assaults, aggravated burglary types of charges. As is typical with a police-involved shooting involving a WPD officer, the KBI, Kansas Bureau of Investigation, is assisting us with the investigation. We will thoroughly vet this matter and investigate, and we will turn the findings over to the district attorney's office, who will make a decision not only on criminal charges of the suspect, but also clearance of the officers in justification of the shoot. On face value, as we look at this, the officers were dispatched to this case, to this call. They were legally there. They were in full uniform. They seemed to act appropriately and within policy and guidelines of the Wichita Police Department. The district attorney will review this case and make final determination of that fact. The officers are on administrative duty, as is WPD policy, and will be so for several days. There's a couple of disturbing trends that I want to bring to your attention regarding this shooting, and it surrounds violence against police officers and mentally ill people. Every year since 2008, we have had an escalation of about 200 cases per year where police officers come into contact with mentally ill people. It is a serious situation, and we are fully cognizant of it. In 2008, we had a little over 1,900 calls involving mentally ill individuals, and in 2011, last year, we had over 2,600. And there was an escalation each year, and the year-to-date numbers in 2012 are tracking the same way. I know you'll ask how many officer-involved shootings we've had this year, and the number is 7. Last year we had 1. In 2010 we had 4. And in 2009 we had 1. That is another trend that we are tracking that is extremely serious, and it's a trend we're seeing across the country. So WPD has an active stance to help mentally ill people. That is what we try to do. We train officers specifically in how to talk to and de-escalate mentally ill individuals. But when we are confronted with weapons, we have to take appropriate action, not only to protect our own lives, but those of others. So this is an unfortunate case. It's a sad case. And as in any police-related shooting, there are no winners. So we will investigate this thoroughly and turn it over to the district attorney's office, I'm going to say, hopefully by the end of the week. So I'll answer what questions I can.
Can you give those stats on officer-involved shootings again? 7 this year?
7 in 2012 year to date, 1 in 2011, 4 in 2010, 1 in 2009.
How much of a distance was there between Mr. McCosh and either the officer who fired or the officer most closely threatened at the time the shot was fired?
I didn't hear the first part, Stan.
The distance between
15 to 25 feet.
When he threw that machete, how close did it come to an officer?
45 feet.
When was the last contact officers had with him prior to this incident?
March of 2011. We were at that house.
Was he on
I'm
anything?
sorry, March of 2012, this year, March of 2012.
Was he on anything? Any drugs, illegal drugs?
We won't know that yet. We'll get a talk screen from him, but that will take several weeks, and that will be part of the ongoing investigation. I can't comment on it today.
Chief, I don't want to get too political with you, but just considering what you were just saying regarding these incidents with mentally ill citizens, interactions with police officers that seem to be going exponentially up, does it concern you at all when you hear budgets being cut on the state and local level for healthcare services for folks in this community, when you're seeing incidents with folks in this community dramatically escalating?
Yes.
Care to elaborate at all on that?
Well, there's two things that concern us. One is that type of budget action, and we all understand budget and the way things are going. A second thing, I guess, that we could do proactively as a community is do some non-adversarial kinds of contacts between our police officers and our mentally ill people. I think it's important that mentally ill people, particularly in cases like this where we make several calls, that there's a relationship between that person and police officers, so that when and if we are called, if there's crisis or trauma, that we know one another and we can talk on a first name basis. So I would promote that to any individual in the community who is either a caregiver for mentally ill or is mentally ill themselves. Please get to know your police officers and develop a relationship so that we don't have this kind of unfortunate circumstance, hopefully.
Do you feel this? I'm sorry.
It sounds like you had that kind of dynamic with this person, though, and it still ended up.
It didn't work out, but we did. The officers knew, and to the person, we're confident that they could go in and de-escalate this, but they also made the comment that if something was different last night in the behavior, and anyone who is related to or knows of mentally ill people knows that's just part of the dynamic.
Can you comment on why they didn't use like non-lethal weapons like a taser or pepper spray? Or
there's a number of dynamics going on there. It's a good question. There's distance and threat, and it's no secret anymore, and I think we've had this discussion. With bladed weapons, there's a misnomer in the public that somebody should be within 2 to 3 feet before they are a threat, and that is not science. Training and science will show you that when a person gets within 21 feet of you with a bladed weapon, even if you shoot them or use deadly force, they can still stab you. And there's documentation of that happening. So there's this distance, and we're 15 to 25 feet away. The effectiveness of a taser is 15 to 25 feet, and as you get further away, the effectiveness is diminished. So there's that kind of conversation going on, and there was discussion of the potential of non-deadly force. And then, unfortunately, what happens in this instance is the suspect makes an overt move to escalate the threat that makes the decision for the officers, and that's what happened here. But that is a good question. It's a valid question, and there's all kinds of dynamics with space and distance that officers are processing very quickly to do the best that they can. And a lot of it, there's an unknown factor here. It's the conduct of the suspect. If something overt happens to change the scenario, then the officers have to react in a certain way, and I think that's what happened last night.
You were starting to close on somebody at the time the officer fired, if I were saying correct.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
The mentally ill person was starting to close on somebody.
That's correct. It's an overt act that the officers have to factor into their logic and their thought process, and they have to do what they have to do.
Where did he obtain the knives? Were they in the mother's house?
Yes. From what we understand, and even from previous calls, he likes bladed weapons, and there's no law that says he can't have bladed weapons, and so he owns them, and he keeps them at that house.
And what's his medical status now?
He is critical but stable. He had surgery last night.
You said he was hitting the torso. I heard one report saying he was hitting the chest. Can you?
Torso is the best I'm going to describe today.
how many times?
Once.
Is he expected to survive?
With abdomen injuries, he's serious. We expect him to survive, but that would be a question for medical clinicians. There could be secondary infections or other kinds of things that happen that could change the status, but we are hopeful and expecting him to survive.
People will wonder how long the officer who fired the shot's been on.
He's a veteran officer.